The battlefield was a wasteland of smoke and fire. Scattered debris from ruined buildings and shattered vehicles filled the air with choking dust. Commander Ryle moved with practiced precision, his armored boots crunching over broken glass and scorched earth. His rifle was steady in his hands, his eyes sharp, scanning for any sign of movement. He wasn't here for glory or revenge, just survival. The human colony on this distant world had fallen days ago. What remained was chaos. Alien invaders hunting survivors, pockets of resistance fighting hopelessly. Ryle was one of the few soldiers still alive and able to fight. His mission now was simple: help whoever he could and make it back in one piece. But he hadn't expected to find them. As he approached the remains of a toppled communications tower, his helmet scanner picked up faint life signs. Curious, he pushed through the rubble, his rifle raised. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Huddled in the shadows was a figure unlike anything he'd ever seen. A tall, slender alien with silvery skin that shimmered faintly even in the dim light. She was clutching a small child, her daughter, he guessed, close to her chest. Her large, glowing eyes locked onto his, a mixture of fear and defiance in her gaze. Ryle froze, holding up one hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The alien mother tensed, shifting to shield her child. The little girl peered out, her small, delicate features marked with innocent curiosity despite the terror around them. "It's okay," Ryle said softly, lowering his rifle. He doubted they understood him, but tone could mean everything in moments like this. "I'm not here to hurt you." The mother's gaze darted to his weapon, then back to his face. She didn't trust him. Why would she? He was a soldier, and she was an alien stranded in enemy territory. But when a distant screech echoed through the air, her fear sharpened into urgency. She knew as well as he did that they weren't alone. "Move," Ryle said firmly, motioning with his hand. He pointed toward a safer area behind a collapsed building. The alien hesitated for only a moment before deciding she had no choice. She clutched her child tightly and followed him. The screech grew louder, joined by the guttural growls of alien soldiers on the hunt. Ryle led them into the cover of a half-buried maintenance tunnel, signaling for them to stay low and quiet. The mother obeyed, crouching down as she whispered something in her own language to her daughter. Ryle caught the faintest tone of reassurance in her voice, a mother's instinct to protect even in the worst situations. As the enemy drew closer, Ryle's training kicked in. He checked his rifle, adjusted his stance, and prepared for the inevitable. The mother glanced at him, her glowing eyes wide with a silent question. "Can you protect us?" When the first alien soldier appeared, Ryle answered without words. A sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the tunnel as he took down the enemy with a clean shot. Another emerged, snarling, only to be met with the same fate. The mother flinched at the noise, clutching her child tightly, but she didn't run. She stayed, watching Ryle with an intensity that unnerved him. The attackers kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. Ryle moved like a machine, taking cover, firing, and eliminating threats with ruthless efficiency. When one got too close, he switched to his combat knife, cutting it down in a flurry of sharp, brutal movements. He was a lone soldier against a squad, but he fought as if the lives behind him were the only thing that mattered. Finally, the tunnel fell silent. Ryle stood in the dim light, his armor scratched and smeared with blood, his breathing heavy. The bodies of the attackers lay scattered around him. He turned back to the mother and child, who were still crouched in the shadows. The little girl was staring at him with wide eyes, no longer scared but something else, awed. The mother stood slowly, her movements cautious. She studied Ryle as if trying to solve a puzzle. He could see the question in her eyes again. "Why would you risk yourself for us?" Ryle didn't know how to answer. He simply motioned for them to follow. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice calm but firm. He couldn't tell if they understood his words, but the mother nodded. She picked up her child, holding her close as they followed him deeper into the ruins. As they moved, Ryle glanced back at the strange pair he'd just saved. Something about them tugged at him in a way he didn't expect. He didn't know who they were or why they were here, but he couldn't bring himself to leave them behind. For now, they were his responsibility. And Commander Ryle never left anyone behind. The ruins stretched endlessly, a maze of collapsed buildings and scorched ground, littered with the echoes of war. Commander Ryle moved ahead cautiously, his sharp gaze sweeping for threats. Behind him, the alien mother and her child followed at a cautious distance. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the crunch of rubble underfoot and the occasional, soft murmurs of the child to her mother. The mother, Ryle still didn't know what to call her, kept her glowing eyes fixed on him. He could feel her gaze, a mix of suspicion and reluctant reliance. She didn't trust him, and honestly, he couldn't blame her. The war between humans and her kind had been brutal, leaving no room for understanding or peace. Yet here they were, thrown together by circumstance. "Keep up," Ryle said over his shoulder, his tone clipped. He gestured toward a safer path through the ruins. "We've got to move faster." The mother narrowed her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she adjusted her hold on her daughter, who clung to her with wide-eyed curiosity. The child, despite the danger, seemed fascinated by Ryle. Every time he glanced back, she was watching him, her small, delicate face alight with curiosity rather than fear. As they navigated through the debris, Ryle spotted a narrow alleyway ahead. It was tight and dark, but it would provide cover from the skies where enemy patrols often searched. He motioned for the pair to follow, stepping into the shadows. The mother hesitated, clutching her daughter tighter. She spoke softly in her language, her voice carrying a melodic quality, though her words were incomprehensible to Ryle. The child nodded, whispering something back, and the mother finally stepped forward. Ryle couldn't tell if they were debating or comforting each other. Inside the alley, the air was thick and damp. The walls were close, forcing them into single file. Ryle kept his weapon ready, his ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Behind him, he heard the child giggle, a strange, soft sound that felt out of place in the ruined world around them. Ryle glanced back, frowning. "What's funny?" he muttered, though he knew they couldn't understand. The child pointed at him, then at his helmet, mimicking its shape with her small hands. Her mother hushed her quickly, her expression sharp, but Ryle couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at his lips. It was the first moment of levity he'd experienced in days. The smile faded as they reached the end of the alley and emerged into an open square. The remnants of what had once been a bustling market were now charred stalls and scattered debris. Ryle froze, scanning the area. Something felt off. The silence was too complete. "Stay here," he whispered, motioning for the mother and child to remain in the shadows. He moved forward cautiously, his weapon raised. The square was empty, but his instincts screamed danger. He crouched near an overturned cart, his eyes sweeping the rooftops. And then he saw it, a flicker of movement, the glint of metal. Sniper. Down. Ryle barked, spinning to shield the mother and child just as the first shot rang out. The bullet hit the ground near his feet, sending up a spray of dirt and sparks. He fired back, his shots precise, forcing the sniper to retreat. More movement erupted as enemy soldiers emerged from the ruins, their guttural cries echoing through the square. Ryle's heart pounded as he took cover and returned fire, his mind racing. They were pinned, outnumbered, and the mother and child were vulnerable. The mother crouched low, shielding her daughter, her glowing eyes wide with alarm. Ryle shouted over the chaos, "Stay behind cover. Don't move." To his surprise, the mother didn't panic. Instead, she did something unexpected. She pulled a small circular device from her clothing and pressed it against the ground. It lit up with a faint hum, emitting a shimmering field around her and her daughter. Ryle stared in shock for a moment before snapping back to the fight. "Nice trick," he muttered, refocusing on the attackers. The battle was fierce, but Ryle fought like a man possessed. His training and instincts took over, every movement precise and efficient. He ducked, rolled, and fired, cutting down the enemy one by one. The tide began to turn, but he knew it couldn't last. His ammo was running low, and reinforcements were likely on their way. "Move to the far side," Ryle called to the mother. "I'll cover you." She hesitated, her eyes locking with his. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile understanding. Then she nodded, scooping up her daughter and darting toward the far side of the square, the shimmering field around them absorbing stray shots. Ryle held the line, his focus unwavering. When the mother and child reached safety, he retreated, firing as he went. They regrouped behind a collapsed wall, breathing hard. The mother looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, softly, she spoke a single word in her language. He didn't know what it meant, but her tone made it clear. She was thanking him. Rel nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Don't thank me yet," he said grimly. "We're not out of this mess." The day had turned to dusk when Ryle finally led the alien mother and her daughter into the shelter of a small hidden cavern. The battle in the square had been intense, but they had made it through. The mother, still unnamed in Ryle's mind, had been surprisingly resourceful. Her glowing energy shield had saved them from certain death, and the way she'd moved in sync with her daughter suggested she had some training herself. But there was something about her that still didn't sit right with him. As the three of them settled down in the dark, cool cavern, Ryle checked his gear, replacing his empty magazines and scanning the surrounding area for threats. The sound of his movements echoed off the stone walls, but he noticed the mother and daughter didn't seem to mind the silence. Instead, they were both sitting in the far corner of the cavern, their heads close together as the mother whispered something in her daughter's ear. Ryle hadn't expected this moment of peace. After all, they were still deep behind enemy lines. He glanced back at the pair, watching as the little girl traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. The mother, a Harry, he had decided in his mind to call her that, though he still didn't know if it was her real name, was sitting cross-legged, her posture graceful but tense. Her large, glowing eyes never left him for long, and though she had remained mostly silent since the battle, her occasional glances told him she was weighing him, studying him. Ryle couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility growing in his chest. Something about their situation made him want to protect them, even if it wasn't his mission. The little girl had a certain trust in him, and that trust, in a way, had already started to pull him in. But a Harry, the mother, was different. She seemed distant, guarded. "You said you're a scientist, right?" Ryle broke the silence, his voice low but direct. A Harry's eyes flickered, the only sign that she was listening. She didn't respond immediately, as if she was deciding how much to reveal. Then, in a soft, almost reluctant voice, she spoke. "Yes, I was part of the Nolari Research Initiative before." She trailed off, her voice faltering for the first time since Ryle had met her. Ryle noticed her discomfort. "Before what?" he asked, his tone gentle. It wasn't like him to pry, but there was something in her voice that made him want to understand. A Harry's gaze flickered to her daughter, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate. Then, with a resigned sigh, she spoke again. "Before the war. Before our world fell." Ryle's brow furrowed. "Your world. You're from another planet." She nodded slowly, and he could see the weight of her words hanging on her shoulders. "We, the Nolari, are a race of scientists and explorers. We were peaceful once, but we were forced to flee our home after it was destroyed by a much more powerful enemy. We've been running ever since." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, though she didn't seem to notice. Ryle stayed silent, processing what she said. He'd heard rumors about alien races on the run, but nothing concrete. The galaxy was filled with strange and dangerous species, but the Nolari sounded different. They weren't invaders, they were survivors. A Harry took a deep breath, seeming to steady herself. She glanced down at Celia, who was now playing with the edge of her mother's cloak. "Celia," she continued, her voice softer now, "is special. She is the key to our survival." Ryle's attention sharpened. What do you mean? What's so special about her? Harry looked at him, her expression unreadable. Her bloodline is unique. It carries a genetic trait that could change the course of this war, but it also makes her a target. Ryle felt a chill run down his spine. A target? By who? Harry's gaze hardened. By the invaders. They know what Celia can do. They'd been hunting us for years, trying to capture her. That's why we've been on the run. Ryle felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The weight of her words hit him harder than he expected. The little girl, the one who had looked up at him with those innocent eyes, held the fate of an entire species in her small hands. And the invaders knew it. You didn't tell me any of this before, Ryle said, his voice sharp. Why didn't you? Harry met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I couldn't risk it. I didn't know who you were. Who could I trust? Humans have their own reasons for war, just as the invaders do. I had to be sure. Ryle thought for a moment, his mind racing. She was right. He was a soldier. He fought for his people, his planet. But after everything he had seen, after saving her and her daughter, there was no turning back. You can trust me, he said firmly. I've kept you alive so far. I'm not going to stop now. Harry studied him, and for the first time, he saw something like relief in her eyes. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. Ryle didn't know what it was that made him feel this way. He wasn't a man of many words, but something about these two, stranded in the middle of an endless war, made him feel a connection, one he couldn't explain. He hadn't been looking for a family. But in this moment, he realized he had found something he couldn't abandon. We're in this together now, Ryle said, his voice steady. I'll protect you both, whatever it takes. Harry finally gave him a small, grateful nod. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But we still have a long way to go. Ryle glanced out at the darkening landscape, his thoughts a storm of questions. He didn't know how this would end. But one thing was certain. The stakes had just gotten much higher. The cavern was quiet, the only sound the soft whispers of wind drifting through cracks in the stone. The air felt heavy with tension, thick with unspoken thoughts. Ryle sat against the cold wall, his helmet resting beside him, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. He had become used to the constant hum of war, the adrenaline, the endless fights, the narrow escapes. But this was different. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal. He looked over at the mother and daughter, who were seated a little farther away. Harry, her silvery skin faintly glowing in the dark, was silently tending to Celia. The little girl had fallen asleep in her arms, her head nestled against her mother's chest. Despite the chaos, despite everything that had happened, Celia looked so peaceful, so innocent. It struck Ryle hard. The child was so young, and yet, her existence carried so much weight. For a moment, Ryle felt something he hadn't in a long time. Something beyond duty, beyond soldiering. He couldn't put a name to it, but it was there. A need to protect them, to make sure they didn't suffer any more than they already had. He wasn't sure how long they'd been hiding in the cavern, but it felt like hours. The quiet stretched on, the stillness pressing down on him. Hey, Ryle said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Harry looked up, her large, glowing eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him told him she was listening. I know it's been a long day, he said, pushing himself off the ground and standing up. But we can't afford to stay here forever. The enemy won't give up. We need to keep moving. Harry shifted Celia in her arms, the little girl stirring slightly but not waking. She studied Ryle for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I know, she said quietly, but we must be careful. The invaders are everywhere. Ryle's brow furrowed as he crouched down next to her, his voice lowering. Then we'll move at night. We'll cover more ground that way. The longer we stay in one place, the more chances they have to find us. Harry's lips tightened in a thin line. And what about Celia? She needs rest. She's not like you, not like me. She can't keep up with long travel in these conditions. Ryle glanced at the girl. I get it, but we'll make it work. We've survived this long, right? We're not giving up now. The silence returned for a few moments, thick with the weight of what they had all been through. Harry looked back down at her daughter, her expression softening. I won't let them take her. I won't let anyone hurt her. Rel nodded, a sense of understanding passing between them. He could see the fierce protectiveness in Harry's eyes, the same way he felt about keeping them safe. There were no words for it, just a shared resolve. They spent the next hour preparing to leave. Ryle checked his gear again, made sure his weapon was ready, and silently took stock of their supplies. He wasn't sure how long they could last with what they had left. Food was running low, and the water ration packs would only last them a few more days at best. I'll take the lead, he said, his voice steady. Harry, you and Celia stay behind me. If anything happens, don't hesitate to fall back. I'll cover you. Harry nodded without a word, standing up carefully and adjusting the little girl on her back. Her expression was unreadable, but Ryle saw the way her hands tightened around her daughter. The bond between them was strong, unbreakable, and it made him more determined than ever to see them through this. With everything packed and ready, they left the shelter of the cavern. The moonlight outside was dim, casting long shadows over the wreckage of the ruined world. The air was colder now, and Ryle couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them. Stay close, Ryle said, his voice barely above a whisper as they moved through the dark. The world around them seemed eerily still, the sounds of battle far away, but still lingering in the distance. They moved swiftly, Ryle taking the lead while Harry and Celia followed closely behind. The terrain was rough, but Ryle was used to this by now. Every footstep was calculated, every move made with the utmost care. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they approached the edge of a small forest, Ryle held up a hand, signaling them to stop. His senses were on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he could feel the presence of danger creeping closer. There was something wrong. Harry's voice was barely a whisper. What is it? Ryle's eyes scanned the trees ahead, every muscle in his body tensed. We've got company, he said, his voice tight. Without warning, the sound of snapping branches echoed through the trees. Ryle's heart skipped a beat as he spun to face the noise, his rifle at the ready. The first alien soldier emerged from the shadows, followed by several more. Ryl's mind raced. They weren't going to make it out of this one easily. Stay behind me, he growled, his voice sharp as he raised his weapon. The enemy was closing in fast. In that moment, everything around him seemed to slow down. There was no more thinking, just reacting. His finger tightened on the trigger as the first enemy soldier went down. But there were more, far more, and Ryle knew this fight wasn't going to be easy. The long night had just begun. The forest around them felt like a trap, each shadow hiding dangers. Ryle's heart raced as the first alien soldier fell, his body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. But there were more, at least 5, maybe more, closing in from all directions. The enemy soldiers were fast, their dark figures blending into the night. Ryl's fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle as his eyes darted from one target to another. He knew he couldn't take them all on by himself. He had to buy time. Stay back, he shouted over his shoulder, his voice low and sharp. I'll handle this. Just keep moving. Harry nodded without question, her face grim but determined. She bent down to scoop up Celia, who was stirring in her arms, wide-eyed and scared. Ryle's mind raced as the mother and daughter retreated behind a thick cluster of trees, staying out of sight, but close enough to stay within reach. The little girl's terrified whimper echoed in Ryle's ears, making his pulse spike. But he had no time to think about that now. The enemy soldiers were getting closer. They were a mix of humanoid creatures with dark, hard-looking skin and sharp, angular features, and Ryle could see their weapons gleaming in the low light. Their eyes glowed faintly, giving them an eerie, otherworldly appearance. One of them raised a long rifle, aiming directly at him. Without thinking, Ryle dropped to the ground, narrowly avoiding the blast. The shot hit a tree instead, splintering the bark and sending a shower of wood into the air. Ryle rolled to the side, quickly finding a new vantage point behind a thick rock formation. His rifle was steady now, his breathing controlled. He needed to be precise. The enemy wasn't giving him any room to breathe, but he couldn't afford to make mistakes. One shot, one chance. Ryle exhaled slowly and fired. The first soldier went down, crumpling to the ground with a burst of blood. Another shot, and another soldier fell. Ryle was moving faster now, his body acting on instinct as he ducked, rolled, and fired. Each movement was like a dance, his focus sharper than ever before. But the enemy wasn't backing down. They were relentless, closing in with every second. Ryle's breath was coming in sharp gasps now, his pulse pounding in his ears. He needed to end this, and fast. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he turned just in time to see one of the enemy soldiers charging toward him with a blade drawn. Ryle barely had time to react. He twisted out of the way, but the soldier's weapon scraped across his armor, leaving a deep scratch. Ryle gritted his teeth, his free hand reaching for his combat knife. The two of them circled each other in the darkness, their weapons clashing with a sharp clang. Ryle's arms burned from the effort, but he couldn't stop now. With a swift move, he disarmed the soldier, sending the blade flying from his grasp. The alien soldier staggered back, and Ryle didn't hesitate. He lunged, his knife cutting across the soldier's side in one fluid motion. The soldier's body crumpled to the ground, unmoving. Ryle took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead, but there was no time to rest. The others were closing in. Ahari, Celia, move, he shouted, his voice rising over the crackling sounds of the battle. He heard the rustling of movement behind him. He glanced back to see Ahari and Celia darting through the trees, moving fast, but with the careful steps of people who had seen too much. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't hesitate. The bond between mother and daughter was undeniable. Ryle saw that in the way they moved together, working as one to stay safe. But there were still more enemies. Ryle's heart pounded as he returned his focus to the remaining soldiers. 3 left. He had to keep them off the mother and child. He couldn't let them be caught. One of the enemy soldiers aimed at Ahari. Ryle's mind screamed as he fired a quick shot, hitting the soldier in the chest. The enemy soldier went down without a sound, but the 2 others were already rushing toward him. He ducked behind a large rock for cover, reloading quickly. His mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a way out, a place to regroup, and fast. As the 2 soldiers closed in on him, Ryle quickly activated a small device on his wrist. A low hum filled the air, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate. Without warning, a sudden explosion erupted from the distance, sending shockwaves through the ground. The 2 soldiers stumbled, momentarily disoriented. Ryle seized the opportunity. He charged at them, taking down the first soldier with a quick strike to the chest. The second soldier swung at him with a large bladed weapon, but Ryle was faster. He dodged, twisting the enemy's arm until the weapon dropped from his grip. In a fluid motion, Ryle disarmed him, his rifle raised. The remaining soldier froze, his eyes wide with fear. Ryle stared at him for a long moment, his gun steady in his hand. "Run," Ryle said, his voice cold. The soldier hesitated, then turned and sprinted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Ryle stood there, breathing hard, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. The threat was gone. For now. He turned quickly to check on Ahari and Celia. They had made it to safety, hiding behind a cluster of trees. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, her body trembling. Ryle nodded to himself, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. They had survived, but he knew this was far from over. The war wasn't going to stop just because they had won one battle. There were still more enemies out there, and they were coming for them. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice firm. "We're not out of danger yet." And with that, they continued on, disappearing into the dark night, the uncertainty of the future hanging over them like a storm. The night air was cold, biting against Ryle's skin as he led the small group through the dense forest. His mind was sharp, constantly scanning the area for threats. But his body was tired. The fight earlier had taken a toll on him, and he could feel the weight of his armor pressing down on him. Every step felt heavier, but there was no time to rest. Behind him, Harry and Celia moved cautiously, their footsteps light but steady. Harry kept her daughter close, her gaze constantly shifting from Ryle to the dark path ahead. Celia, too, seemed on edge, her small form trembling ever so slightly, though she didn't make a sound. The little girl was stronger than she appeared, but Ryle knew the fear still haunted her. It haunted them all. They had made it through the first wave of the enemy, but Ryle couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. The invaders were relentless, and even now, he could hear the faint hum of enemy ships in the distance. The sound was low, but it sent a chill down his spine. The Nolari were on their own, far from any allies, and he couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep running. "I think we should head toward the mountains," Ryle said, breaking the silence that had stretched on for what felt like hours. His voice was low, but firm. "It's the best place to hide. We can't keep running through open terrain. We need to find a safe spot to regroup." Harry nodded, her face drawn with exhaustion. "The mountains," she repeated, her voice distant. "It's dangerous there. The high altitudes could weaken Celia's condition. She needs—" "I know," Ryle interrupted gently, though he was already moving toward the north. "But it's the best chance we have. The invaders can't track us there as easily. We'll have the high ground. We'll survive. We have to." Harry didn't argue. She simply adjusted the weight of her daughter in her arms and fell into step behind him. The forest grew denser as they moved forward, the trees thickening until it almost seemed as though the world around them had swallowed them whole. Ryle kept his pace steady, not wanting to tire them out too quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Hours passed, and the fatigue began to take its toll on them all. Ryle's muscles ached, his limbs growing heavier with every step. He glanced back to make sure Harry and Celia were keeping up. Harry's eyes met his, her expression unreadable, but Ryle could see the strain in her features. She was just as tired as he was, if not more. The journey was taking its toll on her, and she wasn't showing it for Celia's sake. Ryle admired her strength, but he knew it couldn't last forever. "How much farther?" Harry asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryle didn't stop walking, but he glanced back over his shoulder. "Not far, just a few more hours." Harry nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak again, and the silence grew heavier, almost suffocating. Ryle could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. There was so much left unsaid between them, so much left to figure out. They were still strangers, bound together only by the need to survive. The thought made him uncomfortable. He had seen enough of war to know how quickly bonds could be forged in times of crisis, but that didn't make it any easier. Harry was a scientist, a mother, someone who had seen her entire world fall apart. He was just a soldier. He fought because it was his duty. But something had shifted between them. Something had made him want to protect her, to protect them both. It was in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, the way her shoulders tensed when he offered help, the way her voice softened when she spoke of Celia. She was still holding on to something, some piece of herself that she hadn't let go of. He couldn't blame her. He felt it too. The world they had known was gone. All they had now was each other. Another hour passed, and Ryle's eyes began to strain. his mind fighting against exhaustion. The darkness was thick now, the sky above them barely visible through the canopy of leaves. He was about to suggest they stop for a short rest when a sudden rustle in the trees to his left made him freeze. His hand immediately went to his weapon, his body going tense. The air seemed to hum with danger. He glanced at Harry, whose eyes were already wide with fear. She had heard it too. "Stay quiet," Ryle whispered urgently, holding up his hand. His voice was barely audible over the sound of the wind. "Something's out there." Harry nodded, pulling Celia closer to her. Ryle moved cautiously, scanning the area, his senses on high alert. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the noise grew louder, closer. It was not an animal. He could tell that much. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to shift, and a figure emerged from the trees. Ryle's heart skipped a beat, his grip tightening on his weapon. The figure stepped forward, tall and imposing, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't human. It wasn't like the invaders they had fought earlier either. This creature was different, faster, more agile. Its body was covered in dark, scaled armor, and it held a long, curved blade in its hand. Ryle's body tensed, preparing to fight, but the creature didn't attack. It only watched them, its gaze locked on him. Ryle's mind raced. Was this another enemy, or something else? Something more dangerous? "Who are you?" Ryle demanded, his voice sharp, but his heart pounded in his chest. The creature didn't respond. It just stood there, as though waiting for something. Ryle's mind spun, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to do. Then, without warning, the creature moved. Fast, but not toward them. It disappeared into the forest, blending into the shadows. Ryle stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it an enemy scout, or had they just encountered something far more dangerous? "We need to go," he said quietly, his voice tight. "Stay close. We're not alone out here." With that, they continued forward, their pace quickening as the uncertainty of the night closed in around them. The mountain pass was still hours away, but Ryle knew one thing for sure. They weren't the only ones on this road. The mountain pass loomed ahead, dark and jagged, its towering cliffs cutting into the night sky. Ryle could feel the cool wind biting at his skin as he pushed forward. His legs burned from the long journey, but he kept moving. He had to keep moving. The creature that had appeared earlier still lingered in his mind, its glowing eyes, its strange silence. What was it? Was it an ally or a new threat? He glanced behind him at Harry and Celia, their tired faces illuminated by the faint glow of the distant stars. Harry looked exhausted, but she had not said a word of complaint. Celia, her small face pale with fatigue, clung to her mother, her tiny hand gripping the fabric of Harry's jacket. Ryle's heart clenched. They had been through so much already, and it didn't seem to end. "We're close," he said, his voice low but firm. "Just a little farther." Harry nodded silently, but there was a certain tenseness in her posture. She was trying to hold it together for Celia's sake, but Ryle could see the cracks forming. She was exhausted, just like him. They all were. The wind picked up as they reached the base of the mountain, and the air grew colder. The trees thinned out, giving way to rocky terrain. It was harder to move now, the ground uneven and full of sharp rocks. Ryle led the way carefully, picking the safest path through the rocks, making sure that neither Harry nor Celia would slip or fall. "I think we should find shelter for the night," Ryle said as they reached a small crevice between two large rocks. "We won't make it through the pass before dawn. It's too dangerous." Harry hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her eyes scanning the surroundings warily. "Agreed. We need rest, but we can't stay here long. If the invaders find us—" "They won't," Ryle interrupted, trying to reassure her. "We'll stay hidden, just for a few hours. Then we move." He helped Harry and Celia settle down in the small crevice. The place was tight, but it offered some shelter from the wind and the cold. Celia curled up against her mother, her eyes fluttering as she tried to sleep. Harry watched her closely, her hand gently brushing the girl's hair. Rattle sat down a few feet away, keeping his weapon close. He didn't trust the silence of the mountains. The quiet was almost oppressive. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, and Ryle couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He stared out into the dark, his senses on high alert. It wasn't long before Harry spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "What do you think it was?" she asked, her eyes locking with his. "The creature," she clarified, her gaze never leaving his. "The one we saw earlier. What was it?" Ryle exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know. It didn't act like the invaders. It was different. Stronger, faster, maybe even smarter." He shook his head. "It wasn't an enemy scout, that's for sure." Harry stared at him for a long time, as if weighing his words. "Then what?" "I'm not sure. But it didn't attack us." Ryle's voice was low, almost as if he were talking to himself. "It could have. It could have killed us right there. But it didn't. Maybe it was just observing us," Harry said thoughtfully, "waiting for the right moment. Or maybe it wasn't an enemy at all." Ryle shook his head. "If it's not an enemy, then what is it?" "I don't trust it." Harry didn't respond. Instead, she just looked at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Ryle could feel her gaze, but he didn't look away. There was something in her eyes, something that told him she didn't fully trust him either. But that was understandable. He was a soldier. She was a mother. They were from two different worlds. Yet, here they were, thrown together in a world that had been torn apart. "Do you think we'll make it?" Harry asked softly, breaking the silence. Ryle didn't hesitate. "Yes, we will. We have to." Harry nodded slowly, though her face was still drawn with worry. "I hope you're right." Ryle didn't say anything else. He wasn't sure what else he could say. The road ahead was uncertain. Every step they took was a gamble, and he didn't know how much longer they could survive on their own. The enemy was out there, and they wouldn't stop until they were found. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the mountains, snapping Ryle out of his thoughts. He jerked his head up, his body going tense. His senses flared as he scanned the surroundings. That sound, it hadn't come from any animal he knew. "Did you hear that?" Ryle asked, his voice barely a whisper. Harry nodded, her eyes wide. "What was that?" "I don't know. Stay quiet." Ryle motioned for her to stay low as he slowly rose to his feet. He moved toward the entrance of the crevice, his hand on his rifle. The sound had come from the direction they had just traveled, from deeper in the mountains. It was too close for comfort. He looked back at Harry and Celia. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Harry's expression tightened, but she didn't argue. She just nodded and held Celia closer, her eyes full of fear. Ryle moved carefully, stepping softly on the rocky ground. He knew he was taking a risk, but he had no choice. He had to make sure they were safe. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to keep them hidden, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was out there. As he crept toward the source of the noise, a figure suddenly appeared out of the shadows, moving swiftly. It wasn't an alien. It wasn't even a soldier. Ryle froze, his breath catching in his throat. The creature was back. But this time, it wasn't alone.